thank you for being here. I'm going to hand it off to Laura, who's going to warm us up here, but just appreciate y'all joining us for this session on policy awareness and taking action with the policy committee.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. We're excited you're here. A little bit about what we plan to cover today. Obviously, this is our welcome and introducing ourselves. Again, my name is Laura Monagudo, and then we are going to talk a little bit about what the policy committee is in general and why we have a policy committee. We're going to talk about some of the work that our work-based learning transportation work group within the policy committee has been doing. And then I'm going to kind of hand it off to Emily for some general state policy updates. And then we're going to do a little bit of an activity to kind of hear what you all are interested in hearing about and ask you some questions to help us kind of shape where we take the policy committee over the next year or so. So we're excited to get started. As I mentioned, my name is Laura Monagudo. I am a policy and program manager with Ed Systems. Emily, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Ruska. I'm Managing Director of Policy and Programs at Ed Systems. We're one of the 3 network organizers for the Success Network, so we're just very honored to have you all here. Just to get a sense of who's in the room, if folks could raise their hand if you're involved in secondary education, high school, secondary. The plurality here. What about post-secondary partners? Okay. How about employer partners or other workforce partners? A couple strong, and I see some people raising their hands for multiple, which makes complete sense. Adrian, I expect you to see your hand up for almost all of these, right? What about advocacy organizations or policy development? Got a handful. What else am I missing here? Who else am I missing? State government. Oh my God, critical error when we're talking about policy here. Any other state agency folks? Marcy, raise your hand. Nonprofits, other nonprofits, community-based organizations. Awesome. And I know that folks wear a lot of different hats. What I hope that illustrates for people is that, much like with the Greater Success Network, the policy committee is really a space where we try to bring folks together from all of those different arenas. Laura's going to tell you a lot more about the committee here, but just so excited to have you all be a part of this conversation and looking forward to sharing some of the work and learning from you as well.
Yes, thank you. And I just noticed I probably wear this blazer too much. So that's fun. So with that, excited to get started with you all. So Emily gave kind of a little bit of background on, the policy committee, but I want to tell you a little bit more about why we have a policy committee, and also what kind of some of our goals are to do with the policy committee. So we started the policy committee in, I always get the years messed up, December of 2021. 2022, yeah, you're right. Sorry, I should have trusted you from the beginning. December of 2022, because we sort of saw a need in the state kind of environment around college and career pathways to have a place to bring folks together, local practitioners and policy leaders, to kind of connect with each other, to talk about local practices, especially really promising things that are going on, and see if there are ways that those can be elevated to inform state policy, as well as, support local practitioners to take advantage of policy windows or kind of find ways to connect policy to practice. So that is kind of all the why, and that informs what we do with the policy committee. So policy committee has regular full committee quarterly meetings where we learn about emerging education and career policy efforts. We also try to highlight Success Network communities that are doing really promising things around the state when it comes to different college and career policy. Every once in a while, we try to make a point to engage in data, because data and policy kind of go hand in hand, right? We want to inform policy that is happening. So we've held a couple data deep dives as kind of extra meetings that we're having with the policy committee. And then identify opportunities to work together to either advance policy or scale policy. So I think in kind of an example of where we identified policy that actually might be next is our work-based learning transportation work group. So basically the first couple meetings that we had of the policy committee, transportation came up a ton as a topic that was a really big challenge for folks. So we decided to launch a work group specifically to look into and talk about how transportation impacts student access to work-based learning. So, it's come up a couple times today already, which I'm excited that people are talking about transportation. The goal of this work group was to really explore and identify what barriers related to transportation are getting in the way of students participating in work-based learning, with a focus on in-school youth, and really kind of, once we've gathered all of those barriers, thinking about ways that we can, creatively look at them, solve them if there are any particular things when we are trying to solve them that we can think of. Big problem, so not necessarily easy solutions when it comes to transportation for work-based learning, but we really wanted to kind of get in the nitty-gritty and look into barriers, obstacles, and then barriers, solutions, and then gather some student perspective. So when we did all of this, we kind of found barriers fit into 3 buckets. So there were some barriers that really fit in the space of they were barriers related to local or district policy. And then there were also barriers at the systemic level. So examples of local district available there, availability of transportation within a specific community, access to reliable transportation privately. So that's kind of more of like an individual student in their local area. And then systemic barriers, so things like school districts grappling with challenges around what types of vehicles they can use to transport students, and the rules around that, driver credentialing requirements for those vehicles, and then just the overall big bucket challenge of funding. Crazy that comes up here. Funding is a pretty big piece. And then also just making sure to account for equity considerations as well, because, a lot of these work-based learning transportation barriers affect students who are already dealing with a lot of other challenges. So how can we make sure that we're thinking of them as we're having these conversations? So some things in that regard that came up were how compensation for work-based learning factors in, and also just how we can consider the various diverse needs of different students in the solutions that we're thinking about. So at the district and local level, a little bit more about what we saw. Public transportation access was a big topic, and it really varies in terms of what type of obstacle it presents depending on the type of community. In rural and suburban communities, what came up a lot was that there either is no public transportation or the public transportation is limited, so students have to rely a lot more on private transportation, which obviously has some challenges. And then in some more urban and some suburban communities, there is access to public transportation, but there may be other factors impacting whether or not students are actually able to use it, especially as it relates to getting to their work-based learning. So things like fares potentially being difficult, cost prohibitive, routes not really working with the students' schedules, or not going where they need to go for their particular work site. And then also just the longer term costs. So fares kind of came up in that concept of if there is public transportation. If they're doing a longer term work-based learning experience, those fares can really add up, especially if they aren't discounted in any way. So kind of depending on how it works in the local area, that could potentially create some logistical and cost burdens. And then the private transportation piece just really comes down to, some students don't have access to private transportation, or a personal vehicle of their own, a family vehicle that maybe they're sharing with their whole family that they can't use at the time that they need to get to their work-based learning site. And kind of relating to that larger cost piece before is also if students are having to provide their own transportation, a little bit of a cost-benefit dilemma that comes up where they, maybe when they're deciding whether or not to participate, have to think about, is the benefit that I get from doing this worth the extra cost of having to provide my own transportation. And that can be a difficult decision for some students to make. When it comes to the systemic challenges that surfaced with this group, vehicle type restrictions were one thing that came up quite a bit. There are some pretty specific outlines in state law around what types of vehicle people are allowed to use in K-12. What types of vehicles depend on how many students they're transporting and what the purpose of the transportation is. And some districts can run into challenges either being able to get the types of vehicles that they're allowed to use, or how many students they're transporting can be a challenge because maybe they're transporting a really small group of students and the logistics of using a larger school bus don't necessarily work in that situation. And kind of parallel to that is the driver credentialing requirements, right? Most of the options that are available require at least a certain permit. And, you just have to have people in a district where, a lot of people are in general facing staff challenges. So having people also have that permit that are able to have people who can drive those vehicles can be a challenge, especially in small or rural districts. So that is something that we wanted to make sure to note. A big one, systemic level, is funding. So these can be anything from identifying what funds can be used. There are some funds that can't be used for transportation expenses. I have a point here I feel like Kyle highlighted really well this morning about WIOA funds being challenging for folks to navigate. So that's just some places that funding challenges can come up. Equity considerations. This is again where we get back to kind of that cost conundrum, and then especially when you factor in whether or not students are getting paid for their work-based learning opportunities. Is it fair to ask students to provide their own transportation, especially if it is either coming at the cost of the wages they are getting or if you're not paying them? So this really impacts both their attitudes towards and their decision to participate in work-based learning. Again, that idea of, is this cost really worth the benefits I get from the participation? Especially if students have other responsibilities, if they're helping their family, that can be a challenge. So just as we move forward, we really want to be intentional about thinking about ways that we can minimize the burden on the student, so that we can really take that out of their decision on whether or not they would want to participate. And then the diverse needs piece is really just remembering in these conversations that this is a complicated problem with no one easy solution. And while there are some creative solutions that come up in conversation, such as school-based enterprises or virtual work-based learning, it's important not to necessarily default all work-based learning to one of those things, because those are not necessarily going to be the best fit for every student. So that's just kind of a note to keep in mind as we progress through this conversation. The transportation work group released a memo earlier in January that summarizes all of this. So I encourage you all to take a closer look at that memo if you are interested in learning more about these conversations, more about the barriers that we saw come up. The plans for the transportation work group, so this is kind of the trajectory that we've been on. We launched the work group last spring and have met several times. We are wrapping up on a student survey, so we thought that it was really important to make sure that we were getting students' voices in this conversation about how they are getting around, right? So we are wrapping up on a survey, and then from there we are going to eventually release in the spring a second memo that kind of summarizes some solution thoughts, some things to keep in mind as solutions unfold, and some resources as well. So that is our update on our transportation work group. I think, Emily, I have one slide before I hand it off to you here. All right, so my last piece before I hand it off to Emily is to highlight our Career Pathways Dictionary. I don't see too many faces from my session this morning, but I did a session this morning on the Career Pathways Dictionary. The original Career Pathways Dictionary was created in 2018. kind of in response to a need that came up from several pieces of policy around the state that were incorporating career pathways as a key strategy. And as more and more people were working with career pathways, it became pretty clear that we needed some common definitions of career pathways. Something you can think about that I had them do in my session this morning is to try and just from memory define like work-based learning or some of those other terms. I always find it feels a lot more difficult when you're doing it off the top of your head. And I think it highlights why we need something like this. So I encourage you all to take a look. One of the biggest updates that we made is that it used to be a very, very long PDF document, and we changed it into a website, so you can see a little screen grab of the website there. We really wanted to make it more of a user-friendly hub, so we try to link resources whenever possible, include things like implementation guidance, let you know exactly where the definitions are coming from. So if they are definitions that come from legislation or other pieces of state policy, we have that explicitly mentioned. And even if you are really into policy, if you want to go look at the legislation, it's all linked right there. It's super easy for you. So I think that is all I've got to say about the Career Pathways Dictionary. So Emily, all you.
Before I jump in, just want to pause and see if there are any questions about either the transportation work that Laura's been leading with the policy work group or about the dictionary before I just give a little bit of info on some other policy areas. She was very comprehensive, so I don't blame you for not having questions. But also, if you've got thoughts on solutions on the transportation work, please join us because we could use all the ideas we can get. So I'm here to highlight some stuff, and I'm also going to put our friends on the spot who are sitting over here, who I know are deep in the weeds on policy work as well. Noting just a handful of things from the governor's budget proposal last week. I'm sure all of you tuned in on Wednesday at noon to hear the governor talk about what to do in a resource-constrained environment. And so in the face of some budgetary challenges, the governor has proposed a budget that does include some increases in the education funding arena. Not enough, as many would argue. There's never enough money for education ever. But he made the minimum increase to the evidence-based funding formula. There were a lot of advocates, understandably, advocating for a greater investment in the EBF formula because we still have a long way to go to get to truly equitable funding for our school districts across the state. Notably, there was a $10.2 million increase on career and technical education, which is exciting. So hopefully, Marcy's clapping. That coincides with ISB releasing a new funding formula for CTE that is meant to, the previous funding formula was largely grounded in how many courses are you offering? Would you say that's a fair statement? And now it's going to be, how do we incentivize participation in these really rigorous, high-quality courses, right? And so you just heard a panel of students talking about how impactful CTE has been on their experience and how much more they want their peers to be able to access career and technical education. And so investing more money and investing it, making those investments in ways that are going to incentivize school districts to up that access, really making sure that students are accessing those courses is going to be really valuable. And then if you have questions about CTE funding, I'm going to direct you to Marcy right here. There also was a $10 million increase to the MAP program, Monetary Award Program. Those are our need-based grants that are made to students attending Illinois colleges. That's exciting to see an increase in the MAP funding. Again, advocates were calling for more than that. But here we are. $10 million more for MAP is still not nothing. It's still an increase, so we definitely are happy about that. And then there's a lot of things in the governor's budget were what's called flat funding or continued funding. This is where we just start getting into the weeds on just numbers and looking at spreadsheets. But the governor is proposing to extend the Common App for transfer students and investing $450,000 there. Continuing dual credit funding to the Illinois Community College Board. We were very excited to see this. Certainly, ISB plays a very large role. The State Board of Education plays a very large role in dual credit, but getting community colleges to the table is essential, as many of you in the room well know, both in this post-secondary space as well as the secondary space. And so I think it's notable that the governor in the last two budgets has been putting forth this value of we need the community colleges to be a strong player in this space, and here's some money to do it, right? Like not just saying, hey, you guys should do this, and no money to back it up, right? We love an unfunded mandate in the state. And so critically, what ICCB, just to note a couple of things that ICCB did with the funding last year, because it was part of the actual budget, the enacted budget, ICCB used part of that to build their capacity at the agency, right? So they've hired staff that are devoted to dual credit, which is a win, big pro of that. And they also are making grants to their community colleges. And their goal with those grants is to align it with other efforts around college and career pathways broadly in the state, or other incentives and aligned policy areas that make sense to be building from, CTE, the college and career pathway endorsements, et cetera. There's a lot of critical investments, continued investments in teacher prep, teacher pipeline related strategies. So Golden Apple is continuing to get $15.75 million, $8 million for the Minority Teachers of Illinois Scholarship, which again could always be higher, but is a great investment. Another $45 million for ISB's teacher recruitment pilot, which Marcy, again, I'll direct you guys to Marcy for any detailed questions on that, and $50 million for AIM-High. And I'll note that for several of these, this is actually preserving increases that were made in last year's enacted budget. So, even though it's flat funding for this year, this is still higher than 2 years ago, and in some cases, higher than what it ever was, right? So there previously wasn't a line item for dual credit for ICCB until last fiscal year's budget, or the current fiscal year's budget, I should say. Any questions on this that I can then direct to Mike from Partnership for College Completion? Money makes the world go round. So I'm going to specifically call out some dual credit policy work that's been underway. So first of all, the Higher Learning Commission. Raise your hand if you know what the Higher Learning Commission is. Nice. Okay, don't need to explain it. Higher Learning Commission, accrediting body, they govern a lot of higher education stuff for Illinois and for institutions in Illinois. They were the body that had said, these are what the teacher qualification standards are. These are the guidelines that you have to adhere to in order to set your credentialing thresholds for your faculty at colleges and universities in the state that are accredited by them. And that had specific thresholds like 18 credit hours and all these different specifics. HLC has decided to back off and say, institutions, you say it. You figure out what you're going to do here. Now, they have some guidelines in place around, the types of things that higher ed institutions will be taking into account. But what this is moving towards is also an acknowledgement of different ways for individuals to gain the skills and expertise needed to deliver post-secondary coursework. And so things like relevant work experience, things like research background and experience, et cetera. So this is an interesting time because it's a little bit of a deregulation move in a sense. And so in that vacuum, there's some potential challenges that could come up, right? So it could result in a patchwork of qualification thresholds and qualification practices by institutions in our state, and indeed by the states around us. Illinois is not the only state impacted by this. And it also could end up resulting in colleges could decide, well, but before we weren't allowed to go above 18 credit hours in a subject area as a requirement. Now we're going to make it 25 or 24. They could, theoretically. Now, will they? Time will tell. But what the real opportunities are here is that, one, this really kind of aligns with Illinois state policy and what we tried to achieve in the Dual Credit Quality Act with the Professional Development Plan provisions. Is everyone aware of what the PDPs are, Professional Development Plans are? Raise your hand if you don't know what a PDP is and want to know just a smidge more. I've got a couple. All right. Basically, the Professional Development Plan provision under the Dual Credit Quality Act acknowledges that there aren't enough qualified instructors in Illinois to deliver dual credit courses, and we want to scale up dual credit, like we were hearing the students say, right? In order to get those teachers qualified, there was a provision that allowed for teachers to demonstrate a certain level of progress towards the required number of hours in the program that they needed to be able to offer that dual credit, and to set out a plan, an agreement with their post-secondary partner in their high school district to say, okay, I will achieve this in in I think it's 4 years time, right? So they have to demonstrate forward progress. They have to have a plan for getting the rest of their credential. They're not just sort of indefinitely halfway there. But the point is to incentivize teachers to go back and get those additional course hours in order to be able to deliver those courses. So the HLC policy change means that it's kind of in alignment with the PDP plan principles around saying, how do we acknowledge different types of expertise and backgrounds that can lend themselves to someone being on track to be qualified as an instructor, and how do we incentivize them to get what they need? I've already spoken at length about consideration of relevant experience and just acknowledging that like we've long leaned too much on, not too much on, but significantly on academic credentials and academic credentials alone. Everyone in this room knows that you learn from things beyond your academic credentials. Most of what I do now is not what I learned in policy school. It's stuff that I've learned through my work experience and through my relationships with folks in this room and around this conference, et cetera. So there's an opportunity to think about, like, what does it mean to be prepared to teach and shape the minds of tomorrow, in particularly for our consideration, early college credit opportunities. And it also, this policy change also gives us an opportunity as a state and our agency partners like Marcy and there's folks from ICCB here and others to think about how do we align our state policy and determine some statewide policy that can put some bounds on what this will mean for institutions in the state, that can provide some consistency and clarity, particularly for our secondary districts who are going to be grappling with whatever the post-secondary institutions decide to do here. So on that note, this will be my pivot to legislative policy stuff, and I'll just be touching on some of them, and I will kick to my friends over here to see if there's stuff that I have not mentioned after this that they want to mention. But there's a specific bill that is in progress right now, HB 5020. It's an amendment to the Dual Credit Quality Act. It's in direct response to this HLC policy change. It's been developed in partnership with a lot of different entities statewide. So there's representation from secondary, there's representation from post-secondary. Stanford Children Illinois is leading on the bill. Folks from ILLICEP, the Illinois, Rodrigo, help me here, Alliance for Concurrent Enrollment Partnerships. Thank you. You got me through the A, and that's what I needed. Rodrigo from the P20 network has been involved in these conversations. It's been in response to both the HLC policy changes as well as extensive qualitative research that we've done in recent years about the value of dual credit and the barriers that students face and the barriers to offering dual credit. So if you look up the bill today, what you see on ILGA, on the General Assembly's website, is not exactly how the final form of the bill will be. There's some amendments in progress based on negotiations, but I just wanted to flag the kind of thrust of it. Like, what is the point of the bill to not be kind of reinventing the wheel, to Dr. Lovett's point earlier. The point is to bring the Dual Credit Quality Act into greater alignment with other related policy windows, including the Developmental Ed Reform Act and multiple measures placement policies, to help, while emphasizing the need for local partnerships and the desire for those partnerships to be local for dual credit, to help provide a clearer path for secondary districts to have an alternative means of getting dual credit courses or securing partnerships with post-secondary partners to be able to deliver them, especially when they've been kind of hitting their heads against a wall repeatedly with their local partner potentially. Building in a regular cadence for updating the model partnership agreement, not every year, but considering, okay, when policy changes that happen outside of dual credit even, that relate to dual credit, how do we account for those in the model partnership agreement so that it's a really up-to-date resource and really valuable resource for communities across the state? And then again, as we've been talking about, how do we address this systematic need for dual credit instructors? And so how do we extend the professional development plan opportunities? How do we shore up our instructor qualifications framework in response to this HLC change? So this is one specific bill I just wanted to call out because it's very relevant to many of the folks in this room. There will be a one-pager coming out about it, if not tomorrow, probably early next week. I think some final edits are being made on it, but stay tuned for more information on that. There's PCC has been involved in here, Advance has been at the table. There's a lot of really great conversation happening about how do we really center what students need, and how do we make sure that the system is getting the students what they need. So a few other, I'm not going to go into the same level of depth about all these bills. I will note that we are still pretty early in session. some of these are real, some of these are not really real, right? So, like, not all of these bills will do stuff. Some of these bills will make moves, some of these bills will not go anywhere. And it's still, time will tell on some of them. And like I said, I will kick to Kelsey and Mike in a minute here if I've missed big ones, which I probably have from a post-secondary standpoint. But just to highlight some of these, there's a lot of different bills around manufacturing education and manufacturing education instructors. The one I've highlighted here is around, it's a bill that's come up a couple of times where the idea is that ISB would pay half a salary of a manufacturing employee who's teaching a CTE course as a licensed CTE teacher. There's a lot of work around financial literacy as well as digital literacy. So there's a couple bills about that as well. There's some bills around teacher pipeline stuff, including creating a stipend program for student teachers, which I know some of our advocates in the room are behind. There's also some stuff around transition to post-secondary, including requiring. This one doesn't quite make sense to me, primarily because at the point where a student's applying to post-secondary, they won't have the CCP endorsement just yet, but there is a bill proposing that post-secondary institutions will require that. But there are also some bills around uniform admissions and direct admissions and how we can kind of smooth that transition between secondary and post-secondary. There's also a bill about limiting for-profit institution eligibility for MAP grants. Shout out to Mike over here who can tell you all about it. And as there is frequently, there is a bill about community college baccalaureate programs, which we'll see what year that gets legs. Every year it comes up, and not every year does it stick. The last one that I'll highlight here actually is the third line, which is proposing to eliminate the requirement that school districts have an automatic accelerated placement policy. So it softens the language from shall to may, which I personally think has some equity implications, and I'm curious other folks' thoughts on that if that ends up having legs. Kelsey, Mike, any big ones that you want to shout out? I know that there's work on equitable funding for higher ed, obviously. What's the bill number on that? No bill number yet, but there's a bill coming on equitable higher ed funding, which there was a session on that earlier today. Any other big ones that I'm missing? There's some stuff around student mental health on campus at post-secondary.
I think the big one is student teaching.
Student teaching, yeah. So
HB 5414, if you're interested.
5414. Did I get the number?
There's a couple different student teaching bills going around.
I got the wrong one. Okay.
Good idea.
Yeah. Anything else that folks have? Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Did you say the MAP grants for exonerees?
I did not say that one. You want to say just a little bit about that?
I don't know much.
MAP grants for exonerees.
Yeah, I think it's that MAP grants for people who've been exonerated of some kind of, in some way. I think it now maybe applies to their family as well.
Yeah, I think it's a multi-generational.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff out there. This is only a small subset. These are some of the ones that have already made it to have been assigned to committee, right? So there's still a bunch that are sitting in the Rules Committee. For those of you who don't know, the Rules Committee is where bills have to hang out for a while before they get assigned to a committee that is relevant to what the subject matter is, and then they get heard again, and then they either move or they don't, and sometimes they get kicked back to the Rules Committee, and that means they're dead, and things like that. This is legislative session 101. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot more to come, and certainly when folks are getting into the appropriations conversation and we think back about what the governor proposed versus what's going to become the actual budget, I think there's a lot to come here. We'll be keeping an eye on these and others as they pop up, and we have a March Policy Committee meeting where we'll talk more about sort of what the latest and greatest is. So by that time, maybe some of these will have moved, been amended, new things will have popped up, et cetera. But we're certainly receptive to what people are most interested in learning about. Now, I'm going to bring Laura back up. Or stay down. Yeah, go for it.
I feel like for what we're going to do.
That's true. I can.
All right, so, that was a little too close. Okay, so the next kind of section of this, so it sounds like some of you may have been familiar, may have been on our policy committee meetings before. They are open call to anyone who wants to come join us. So if you are not getting our policy committee updates, feel free to chat. I can tell you how to sign up for those invitations, reminders. But we kind of wanted to take the opportunity of having a bunch of policy people in a room and finding out more what people want to hear about. We're kind of trying to plan for our next several meetings and what exactly we want to focus on. So these are some things that have come up in some of our conversations through December and January that people were interested in. So some people wanted to know more about what it would look like for post-secondary enrollment, that there's going to be a pretty significant drop in the college-age population coming up. Some people wanted to know about career pathways for different populations. There was interest in learning about career pathways for individuals with disabilities, as well as a few other different groups. Some people mentioned with kind of the uptake in the college and career pathway endorsement, what it looks like to create currency to sort of motivate students to earn that endorsement so that they get something for it. Some conversations about transfer, and then potentially featuring one of our communities about transitional instruction. So those are just some ideas, but like I said, we want to take advantage of the fact that we have you all in a room. So if you saw me sneaking around trying to hang up all these giant Post-its without making too much noise while Emily was talking, it's because we want to take the chance to ask you all some questions. So we have a few questions outlined up here. I'm going to leave it up because I didn't write the whole question on the signs, but basically we have right here, we have pressing topics, so topics that you think are really current that would be good for the policy committee to hear about. In the corner over there, I think we have communities. So what topics would you want to hear from fellow communities or practitioners about? So like CCPE currency could be an example, but things where you think this policy is something that I want to understand a little bit more and I want to see how it's coming into practice. I would like to hear from another practitioner or community about how they're doing it. And then over in that corner, we have what would you want to hear about from a state agency or policymaker? So that is an example. That's our one question in that corner back there. And then I think the fun question that Emily and I really enjoy over here by all of our policy advocacy folks is if you had a magic wand, what state policy would you change or create?
So we're going to take a little tour here as people are putting up Post-it notes. More courses in math and science eligible towards pathway endorsement and badging. I love that idea. That's a pressing topic. Okay, separation between CT and STEM teaching, very related. What's happening with some college and no degree, loan forgiveness, re-enrollment, literacy, FAFSA completion. How do we increase it besides making it a grad requirement? That's a cool concept. Accelerated tenure rules, including CTE and CTEP and CTE. More ideas, more ideas. Balancing, economic equity. How do we balance career certificates and employers and jobs? Love this. GED to jobs. Love all these ideas. Funding for English learning for new arrivals and migrants, as well as workshops on benefits of career pathways. These are all really great ideas. Don't forget to add more on the pressing topics if you have more. Here are some of the things that folks want to hear about from their fellow communities. So mental health of students and practitioners, teacher turnout, burnout, etc. Use the power of ed systems, thank you, ISB, Marcy, and state government agencies to do a better job connecting to the business community. Shouldn't be district by district. Okay, how do we systematize that? That's really cool. Tax credits for paying tuition and college expenses for students to encourage college completion without debt. Folks want to hear from neighboring districts about using title funds to increase visibility of MAP grants and how you can best reach students. What are the best media and platforms for reaching students? I'm going to miss one, but I'm going to come over to the policymakers, making my lap here, getting my steps in. Okay, so I think I just mentioned this as an interesting idea that I personally hadn't heard of, but providing CTE students with tuition-free coursework to become a CTE teacher. There's an example of Wyoming doing this. That's very cool. Folks want to hear from policymakers on the alignment between ISB and ICCB dual credit expectations. Marcy, we're going to task you with that. And also wanting to hear from policymakers about what high school teachers can do to support. Laura, you have been processing our magic wand here, wands plural.
Yes, we have a couple about childcare. Childcare access at community college for student parents, and also childcare for teachers, because it's hard to keep teachers in the classroom. Full funding for the equity-based funding, full funding for the new funding formula. I didn't actually do that on purpose. They're just all next to each other. Tuition, room and board free at all public higher ed. Create a new state scholar type recognition program for CTE. More flexibility for state funds provided to WIOA agencies. Decouple the MAP grant from FAFSA app completion, make it automatic and set an amount. If there are bills to pay manufacturing employees to teach CTE, how about STEM professionals to teach STEM? Policy to help take down insurance barriers for work-based learning. Make college affordable. Amen.
No. Okay, our next meeting is March 20th. The materials from this session are going to be available on the Success Network website. We've got a kind cameraman who's been filming us this whole time, so the recording will also be up there. Thank you very much. The links will all be in there. We'll also make sure to link to the next policy committee meeting, but you should join us. It's always a good time. There's lots of really interesting conversation. We've had the opportunity to hear from colleagues such as Rodrigo has presented on the policy committee before. We'll probably make Marcy present on stuff at some point. Mike, Kelsey have both presented before, and I'm sure will again. But we love having the policy committee. It's such a valuable space, and just huge kudos to Laura for her leadership in that space.
Yeah, I was just going to add two things. One, if you are not getting our policy committee communications and you would like to, you can sign up on the Success Network website. There's a policy committee tab. And then at our March 20th meeting, one of the things that's going to be one of the highlights, aside from, like Emily said, some updates on this legislation as the session moves along, is also going to be, if you didn't have a chance to catch Mamusi's session earlier, it's going to be about some updates to the Success Network dashboard, which is a really cool dashboard. Mamusi's put a lot of work into. People can look by community at different remediation. He just did a big update that added early college data, and a lot of that is disaggregated.
Not to steal the thunder. Disaggregated and in a trend format. So like these are data from the report card, which has so much data and it's amazing. And also the visualization that you can do in the dashboard, which is based on Tableau. So you can kind of toggle through a number of different ways. You can isolate your leadership community. You can isolate school districts. And you can look at it in a trend way. The functionality of it is really amazing. And so even if you're not a data nerd, there's a lot you can learn.
Yeah, people really enjoyed hearing from Mamusi when he talked with us about kind of the first stage of the dashboard. And so I think it is a cool tool that we hope you all will be interested in learning about. Thanks for coming.